Nice to see everybody. Thank you for supporting us by attending. We this is part of our Peacemaker Circle format, and many of you know because you've been in a lot of these. We really try to move around topically, move around the various points of interest and engagement and involvement for Zen peacemakers, and this could be conflict, war and peace, refugees, gender issues, racism, poverty, homelessness, the environment, the arts, pure dharma, any number of things like that. So, and we try to do one of these a week. Sometimes we do two a week, just to let you know. And then thanks to all of your support. And we put these on at no charge to anyone. If you can donate, it helps us immeasurably. In 2023, we did 53 events. Last year, we did 115. So we've really tried to ramp it up and really to continue to keep things varied. This week alone, I have 2 meetings with groups that we'll be bringing in this spring. I'm here in Colorado, down in the lower right-hand corner of Colorado. Secondary, not as well known as Wounded Knee, but the Sand Creek massacre occurred down in southeastern Colorado, and there's a Sand Creek Foundation, and we'll have guests. I'm meeting with them in a couple hours here this morning, but we'll have them as guests a little later in the spring. Right next to Sand Creek is an internment camp that was part of Executive Order 9066 in whatever it was, 42 or 43. There were 7,000 Japanese American, mostly citizens, interred down there in southeastern Colorado, and they're going to be a guest a little bit later this spring. So yeah, I'm kind of off topic a bit, but I just wanted to share that with you, that we're always trying to look ahead. We're planning 2, 3, 4 months ahead all the time to try to keep these interesting. So thank you so much for being here and for supporting us. Today, we're really blessed to have my new friend, Reverend Dr. Leonisa Ardizzone, as our guest. And she has I'm going to let her describe what it is that she does, but she has a very unique mission in this world related to making peace. And it couldn't be more core to what it is that we do at Zen Peacemakers. We were chatting. I always like to say the green room. Of course, there isn't a green room. There isn't even a room, but let's call it the green room. We were chatting in the green room just a few minutes ago, and this is just profoundly timely and intimate for me. I can share, but I know for all of you, I would imagine as well, with what's going on in not just in the United States, but around the world. And I think Leonisa's message today is going to be on the mark, and hopefully healing and inspiring. So know that we will have time for questions, comments, and so forth. We always want to keep these as interactive as possible. This is not a lecture. This is community. So please plan to speak up when the time comes if you're so moved. And with that, I'm going to step back, because you didn't come to hear me, and pass the talking piece. And I actually have one. This is a piece of a cedar tree from Utah, one of the largest organisms on Earth, that its DNA is 10,000 years old. So that's Leonisa, I'll pass my cedar log to you, and I'll mute myself. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you. I'm going to go to my view here. Hi, everybody. It's exciting because I'm seeing folks from my cohort and folks I haven't met yet. So it's very nice. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start a slideshow in the moment, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So today we're here to talk about peace education. And I'm not going to talk about it right this moment because that's what the slides help me do. But I have a PhD in international educational development, but with a specialization in peace education. And I got that 25 years ago before the program I was at Columbia sort of figured out a way to get rid of the peace education program or reduce it only to a master's degree, which happens in lots of places because there's not a lot of places to study peace education. And I have been a teacher since 1992, working in a whole variety of places. So, education has always been my calling. I first taught in the Pacific Northwest at an intertribal Native American school called the American Indian Heritage School in Seattle. And then I taught for BOCES, which is the special ed department of New York State, up in upstate New York, working with kids who are historically and then labeled emotionally and behaviorally disturbed, which is not really a nice catch-all, but that's how it was described, and pregnant and parenting teens. And then I taught in Manhattan, then I got the doctorate, and I've been mostly working in either academic circles or nonprofit. And I'm also an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. But that is to say that I've been a Buddhist a lot longer. I've been a Unitarian. So in UU world, we call ourselves, like Buddhatarians or Buddha, all right, people know what I'm talking about, right? So what's really nice about becoming a Unitarian Universalist is you don't have to give up all the other things. You can have what one of my professors in seminary called multiple belongings. And I was like, I like that phrase. I'm sure others of us in this room have this sense of multiple belongings too. So, and right now I am a professor at Vassar College, where I teach education courses, including explicit peace education, and then courses where I have a peace education lens and it's in there no matter what, because I just can't not do it. And I founded about a year and a half ago the Peace Education Center of the Hudson Valley, which has a website that I'll share with you all. We're actually redesigning it. They're working on it right now, and I hope to launch it tonight. So, and I'm going to encourage us as I do a share screen. I'm going to share sound too, because we have a video at one point. So play from start. Okay. Okay. Everybody can see that? Good, good, good. So the first thing before I meant to do that, I just wanted to see if everybody in their chat would like to drop one word of how you're feeling today. Just give me a check-in word. And drop it in the chat and we'll get a little chat waterfall. Nice. Energized. Curious. Thank you. Clear. Humming with the blues. Anxious, concerned, hopeful, unsettled, quiet, open, anxious, hopeful, ready, worried, weary, thrilled to be alive, celebrating, anticipating spring, yes, receptive. That might cover everybody. So this is a practice I do in actually all my classes and all gatherings, because I want to get a feel on what's in the room. And since I told you that I work with young people, oh boy, sometimes this brings me a whole lot of worry too, right? They talk about being overwhelmed and exhausted, and some of it's their work and some of it is just the state of the world. And I think it's really important, and not something we typically do in K-12 education or even higher ed, is getting a read on the room. So I like to do that. And then what I like to do too is break it up. So this week we talked about something that brought us joy or the highlight of our month, so that we break up feeling the heavy emotions and also have time to talk about the things that get us through, right? So anyway, today we're here to talk about peace education. I'm glad you're all excited to be here. I am as well. And I'm going to start by introducing you to the founder, or the recognized founder of peace education internationally. Now, this is not saying that things that are peace education practices or related were not done all over the world, right? And certainly in indigenous communities and other things, right? Like we know there are people who have actually believed that peace is a concept and is possible. But Betty is who I met, who's who I studied with at Columbia Teachers College, and she passed away just about a year, November of 23. This was a group of her beacons of light, as she often called us, at her 90th birthday party. And we all teach and work in different parts of the US and the world. My colleagues in Jordan, Japan, right? There's Californians in there, Ohio, DC. But I always feel I need to, and they always ask us about our ancestors. And I feel like Betty is definitely an ancestor and was my greatest mentor. If you have questions about Betty, I would like to point out right now that she has written a ridiculous amount of things. On the Peace Ed website, we recently linked to her archive, which is hosted at the University of Toledo, Ohio, by my colleague Dale, the tall guy. But some of her books that I think y'all might be really interested in, one of my favorites is called Sexism and the War System, coming right at you there, and the Comprehensive Peace Education, Educating for Global Responsibility. I mean, it goes on and on. So yeah. And then I also have other articles that either I've written or my colleagues, and I have, kind of a Google folder that I can share with people if you want to keep reading on this. But I like to start with my bow to Betty for bringing me to where I am today, answering questions for me that I didn't know what to do with. So I just want to like a little background on peace education, because you've probably heard of peace studies or peace research. So those fields existed, right? Largely because people were trying to understand war and why we have war and why we keep having war. And we were supposed to have just this great war, and that was supposed to be the end of the wars, right? And forgetting all the other things that came maybe before it. But yes, certainly since then. So people started studying. Some of the real pioneers in those fields are the Bouldings. If you've ever heard of Elise Boulding, maybe reading some of her stuff. I'm thinking of Americans, or United States folks, and then I could think of others too. And that led to the idea of peace research. And this was also mostly done on the, war, what we call in peace education, the war system, but, wars, how to end war. It drifted very solidly into nuclear war when people were trying to understand that, or at least trying to bring attention to it. And then there's also psychological components of it as well that fall under peace research. And so then these two things they're all really braided. I sort of have them as leading to one another, and they did, because peace education was the one that kind of came along the latest. The person I think of when I think of early pioneers, like before Betty, is one of my other educational heroes, which is Maria Montessori. So the work she was doing with, orphaned children in northern Italy and disenfranchised and the poor was very much grounded in this idea of creating peaceful societies and communities of care and fighting against these forces that oppress. And so, I'm throwing her in the mix there because it makes sense. And so, but I'll tell you a quick about Betty's story. Is right around World War II. Her father was a soldier, and a lot of his friends were vets, and so she was a historian, and then was becoming a history teacher. And she had these cheeky stories, but she said basically she tried to start asking questions of these people who served, and many of whom kept weapons and things, and she was trying to understand where they were landing on if war was a good or bad thing, how it affected them, how we can talk about it, because not a lot of people wanted to talk about it. And so she realized that it was very funny to hear her say this at her 90th. She's like, if I just, played into my young woman charms, I could get into lots of conversations. And then she said, but you know what I mean, and I'm it's not saying that it's just that, but she was trying to tell us that being confrontational in a way was not the way she was going to have an engagement. And so she was like, she'd start conversations and figure out how to find the inroads into these conversations. And I have to say, I learned a lot from her, from hearing those stories and versions of those, 30 years ago, because, as an Italian person, I'm pretty confrontational. I have very clear thoughts and grew up in a pretty non-communicative, very, racist, working class, working poor family. So to have ideals that were about liberation and things, yes, you would assume there would be more socialists given Italy's history, more socialists in my family, but that was not the case. So part of peace education and what she started to do was do this in a standard history classroom. Like, how do we teach history in a way that's not just about the history of war and the history of victors, which unfortunately, it still sort of remains that. How do we do this? How do we write curriculum? And so she started connecting with other teachers, and then she started traveling abroad where more of these conversations were happening in places like Sweden and Japan. And until she was probably in her 80s, she'd spent almost half the year traveling back and forth to Japan and spots in the Middle East and, Sweden and other places, and created this basic global network of peace educators. So just to give you the lay of that land there. So here it is, the little overview, some slides developed out of peace research and peace studies. So initially, peace education, and in Betty's mind, as I said just now, was really focused on ending war. And then when the realization was that war is a manifestation of other issues, right? And that's only one piece of the violence. It started to shift to say we're committed to understanding and eradicating violence in all its forms. And I'm going to talk about those forms of violence in a moment. That comes from Johan Galtung. I'll give you a slide on that. And then we're also going to talk about negative and positive peace, which came out of peace research as well. But if I had to put like the big money on something, peace education is really designed to be transformational. And so later on, we're going to talk a little bit, or I'd love to answer questions too, about like sometimes how hard it is to do peace ed in standard spaces because of this desire to be transformational. It sometimes cannot get traction because it's viewed as anything from utopian to, communist, right? And so we'll talk about that. But the part that underlies that is that it's really about fostering critical consciousness. And it uses Paulo Freire's framework about the oppression. And I don't know if I have a slide on that, but we'll talk about that in case you're not familiar. It's meant to be comprehensive, holistic, and multidisciplinary. And I say this with a pause because I'm also of the mind, if we can just do it somewhere, let's do it. And this is the ideal, comprehensive, holistic, multidisciplinary. But there's resistance, so we have to do done in formal and informal education spaces. In my experience, I've had a lot more success, in quotes, right, to doing it in informal, which says information. I meant to say informal. I'm sorry. I missed that. Informal education spaces because it doesn't have as much of the top-down mentality as formal schooling does. And as I mentioned earlier, it is actually applied all around the world, a lot more than it is here. And so I wanted to also, I use this image of an umbrella, right? So when I was studying peace ed and writing my dissertation 26 years ago, I was, doing my lit review and gathering all this information, and I was seeing all these programs. And I was also a teacher at the time who saw, does everyone remember character education when that came along? Like, how do we educate for character, right? And I had this book of virtues and those things that went with it, right? And then there was this big push about conflict resolution, which, I worked in schools where we definitely needed mediation and conflict resolution. Later along came social emotional learning, right? Because people finally to realize, oh yeah, kids actually, it's not just about content and intellect. They are actually these complex social beings, right? Restorative justice has become more popular these days, which is great. I mean, kicked off by Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, but now we have one in my county. There are schools in New York City who have restorative justice programs. We have a restorative justice coordinator at the college that just came on. And then these other things about critical pedagogy and culturally responsive pedagogy. So when I was seeing all those things, I just kept thinking, they all fall under this umbrella that I think is peace education, right? Because they're all trying to do this work of how do we treat each other better? How do we address things interpersonally and systemically, right? And I think the problem is so many of these things focus on the personal or the interpersonal, which is great. We all should do that. But peace education is saying we have to go that next step and make it this global and systemic pieces of work towards change. So this is not like saying none of these things exist. It's saying whether they realize it or not, I like to view it as falling under practices of peace education as well. Okay, so here comes the juicy spot. And I always joke about this, and I was saying this to Jeff earlier, that as a peace educator, I have a pretty, what I call the bleak worldview, because we view everything through the lens of violence. Everything is violence, right? I mean, if there are counterparts to that. Doesn't mean I don't live joyfully and I don't have gratitude and I don't have a garden. Those are all joyful things, right? But I look at the world through this frame and lens of violence. And it's informed by this work done by Johann Galtung in 1968 or 69, 68, which is in the corner there. And I wanted to take a moment. Has anyone, like, I can't see all your faces, so I'm going to adjust so I could see more faces. Have you heard these terms before? Structural, direct, and cultural violence? I'm seeing a mix. Okay, so some no's and some yeses. Okay, no, lots of no's. Okay, good. Then let's talk about them. So I think, well, let me say this too. So when I first started teaching university level, which was 24 years ago, I couldn't have conversations about this big triangle of violence, this interconnected violence triangle, till about 6 to 8 weeks into the semester. Students were really resistant to the notion that violence was a systemic thing, that racism was a systemic thing, right? We were still in the mindset then, this is what, the 90s, early aughts, of these things being personal or interpersonal, right? Except in Peace Ed, we've been talking about this forever. And I want to say that now, day one, I talk about this with my students and they're mostly with me, which is actually, I don't know if it's evidence of anything, but I'm treating it as evidence, right? I'm a scientist at heart. So I forgot to mention that my background is as a biologist and a science teacher. And so that'll come in later. So I should drop that in there. Anyway, so Galtung originally started with the notions of structural and direct violence, so that those two sides there, and was saying that and Freire, who's the Brazilian pedagogue, activist writer, he also points out that what we typically think of violence is this thing that we call direct violence, which is actors acting on other people. So it's like war is violence, right? Crime we view as violence, attacking, domestic violence, all the things that go with, these acts of violence that basically either take life or take dignity or dehumanize in some way. And that is pretty much the standard conception, right? And then both Galtung was writing about this, as was Freire, and actually so was Dr. King, and that's the next slide, seeking that, well, direct violence doesn't come from nowhere, right? And so peace research, Galtung was a peace researcher, and he was saying, well, there's a reason that people act out like this. There's a reason we do these things. And what he put forth is this notion of structural violence. And structural violence is the violence, or invisible violence, it's called sometimes, systemic violence, and indirect violence, it's called. And it's the violence that is embedded into social systems and society. So it's sort of like you're in the fishbowl and you're swimming in this water of violence, so you don't even know it's there, because it's just how reality is, or how reality seems. We can break it down and look at it from the lens of race. And then we could go, oh yeah, we live in a country, if we're all in the United States, founded on the entire genocide of a people, and the entire enslavement of people who were kidnapped from their own sovereign nation states, right? However, they called them, not what we call borders now, but they had communities, right? So if it's in our DNA, and we go to school and we go to church and we have work or whatever, right? The structural violence are the things we don't see, or that we just assume is the natural order. I think that's another good way of putting it. And it's things like all the forms of oppression that we encounter, or all the forms of oppression that maybe we hear other people encountering, or that we might be complicit in, right? And so So that's why I say I go through the world with this vision of like glasses that are just like, if everything's violent, it allows me to critically analyze every issue I see through this lens of who is oppressed, who is doing the oppressing, where is the harm coming from? And then we have another question. I'm going to save it. I almost gave it away, but I'll get there. So, and then then a few years later, or maybe it was right around this time, Galtung added cultural violence. And it's really connected. I mean, it's connected to both of them, but I think about it of the ways we get enculturated to live in a violent society and take it as the norm. So I usually point out schooling as a form of cultural violence and organized religion as a form of cultural violence and media as a form of cultural violence, right? And this is not to say it's the video game argument, because there's so much data that disprove those things. It's more like the information you get. I mean, I think most of us on this screen have, got our news for many years before the 24-hour news cycle decided to kick in, right? And we could watch it or not at 11 p.m. or 6 p.m. and then move on. Now we can't escape information. We can't escape media and what they're selling. And then you add in algorithms, right? And so, and I could say as a teacher, I was hoping that, when I became a teacher in 91, 92, that teachers would have more autonomy as the years went on, that there'd be greater openness into what we were teaching. There'd be more critical thinking. There'd be more critical pedagogy. And it's actually become the opposite. Like my students now who want to become teachers are like, well, where can I teach where I can do these things that I think students need, right? It's like a really fundamental question to think about, like, given that schools are part of this cultural violence. So another quip I often say when I think about education is like, some people say, oh, our systems are broken, we're not educating critical citizens. And I say, no, it's doing exactly what it's designed to do, right? It's not, you show me, and what happens is you have little, fabulous private progressive spaces where they are learning this stuff. And there's, amazing research done on how it's often based on socioeconomics and race, right? And so you get a little more freedom to learn if you can pay for it, right? But in standard public education, that's not always the case, unless individual teachers or principals take this on as their mindset. So I want to pause. Does anyone have any questions for clarification on these 3 forms of violence? I can't totally see, so.
And if people want to use the electronic hand under React, as we have, David Gibson, I think I saw you put your hand up. I can't see everybody, but I.
Yep, I did. Thanks, Jeff. So with the organized religion and with schooling, can you give just an example or two, sort of practical examples of why you believe that those institutions instill cultural violence? Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Great. That's a great question. I'll start with religion as an ordained person too, who's studied a variety of religions. I know examples from colleagues and friends of, in certain Christian denominations, women are instructed, like outwardly instructed by pastors, to accept violence at the hands of their partner because their future will be peaceful in the next life, and because the man is the head of the household according to certain scripture they use, right? Like, so it's what we used to joke in seminary. It's like the redacted or the redlined Bible, where you pull out the things that serve a purpose that you have. So I think gendered violence comes through a lot in organized religion, like the fact that I started out life as a Catholic, very religious and faithful person, and left for many reasons. But one of them was they didn't take me seriously as a woman of faith. I could never be ordained as a Catholic person, right? And had to then, and then so the gender piece is one thing. And in school, I have so many, but I'll stick to a couple. One I always think of is how we base school on competition right? Like, and back in the day, although in some schools still they rank students and will hang it on walls, right? Or they have to take standardized tests that have no nuance for who you are as a learner, but it's so that you get one right answer at any given moment. And to me, that's also kind of a training to kind of accept that there's one way to do something, right? And so high stakes testing is part of that. Testing hierarchy, the way schools are often designed, right? Like Paulo Freire always said, teachers should be co-learners with their students. I mean, I still believe that after 30 years of teaching, and yet often in classrooms, it's this high, the principal has a say, right? They get mandates, they have a say, they tell the teachers, and the teachers are above students instead of, and I think it's training us all to accept that hierarchy is the only way a community can function, right? And then don't get me started on capitalism, because I think capitalism ties into that as well, right? In some ways, right? Does that answer that, David? Does that help other folks too? Good, good. All right. And so I want to point out too how they're all interconnected, right? So if you are deeply mired or oppressed by structural violence, and you know that you can't like walk up to the president or the head of your company, like who's making 400 times you as a CEO while you barely can feed your children, and you can't kill them or take over the company, people act out violence, their direct violence, laterally. So that's why people, when they use the excuse like, oh, look at all the violence in these inner city or neighborhoods, and it's like, well, if you create a system of violence, where does all that go, right? Like, is it's internal pain, it's trauma, it's feelings of hopelessness, it's feelings of I can't ever get out of this system. So what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to go knock over the bodega on the corner, because at least then I can buy some food, maybe, or drugs, so I can numb myself from this, right? Like it's on many, so they're interconnected. I wanted to throw that in, if that makes sense, Dewey, right? And that's why I threw that little, looks like a recycling circle, right? But in there that it's cyclical. Yeah. Any other questions, or can I show you what Dr. King came up with, which was quite similar to this? Okay, good. So almost at the same time, different terms. And if you, oh God, I forgot which address it was. He talks about what he calls his triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism. So while they're not one-to-one exactly, we can see, right, racism as he's trying to make the point that racism isn't I don't like you because the way you look. Racism is a global and structural concept, right? Shows up worse in some places than others, shows up worse for some people than others. And I imagine if he were alive today, it would also be sexism, misogyny, right? Anti-trans, right? Homophobia, right? Like all those isms, all the oppressions. Militarism, have you ever looked at like the United States budget and what percentage goes to the Pentagon and war, right? It's usually between 45 and 51%. Since every year I download it from the War Resisters League. I'll get you that too. And you realize that we are just mired in this idea, right? Like that militarism, might is right. This notion of physical violence answers all the questions. And I love the materialism language, because it's another piece of the culture, the distraction culture of like, I need this to be happy. Buy this, buy it with one click, get it in 2 hours, right? And, look at, if I have stuff, again, I shouldn't say this in front of my addiction, which is this wall of books here. And Jeff, you're guilty of it too, right? But I always feel bad when I bring that up, but I have a vice. It's called books. It's better than other vices, right? But that notion of how we culturally dupe people into thinking that stuff matters rather than what's inside, and relationships matter, which I feel like preaching to the choir to a room full of Buddhists on that one, right? So hopefully we get those ideas. And I think the Quakers do a really good job of teaching about simplicity, along with the Buddhists too. So, and keep track of time here. Okay. So I also wanted to just put this in here, and then I have a little video that demonstrates it that I made with children at the congregation I belonged to years ago. So David Hicks and others were trying to conceptualize peace and violence, right? So violence in this sense shows up in the personal violence, right? Let's say with war and violence, right? And direct violence, sorry, and then indirect or structural violence, right? And what happens is most people, when we're not actively in a time of war, which is almost impossible for the United States. I have another teaching resource. It's a graphic novel called Addicted to War, and it shows every conflict the US has been involved in since its inception, and it's nonstop, right? But people say, oh, look, we're not in a war, so we must be living in a time of peace. Have we all heard that phrase, right? We're living in a time of peace, right? But that to me is like the Pax Romana or the Pax Americana, whatever you want to call it, which is maybe no one's getting actively killed on soil by bombs or whatever in our mindset. But that's not actually peace. So the phrasing of that is called negative peace, where we are taking away this personal violence or this physical violence, right? But we don't get to true peace or what we call positive peace until we actually take away structural violence. And then to take that idea further is then, if you picture it, well, the video shows this, I won't say it, is to replace the structural violence with their antitheses, right? Like if we're taking away things like poverty, then what are we doing, right? Are we making sure there's, universal basic income, right? Or things like that. So right now, I don't even know if I don't think we're living in negative peace even, right? And we're certainly not living in positive peace. So I'm going to have a bunch of young children show you this concept. Most of the hands that you'll see in this video, let's see, my daughter's in it and she's a senior in college. So all of them are now in their 20s, just about. But I think it might make a point for you to get that. So let's see. Oops.
I don't know if it's just me, but we're not seeing anything.
Really? Wait.
I can see. Yeah,
Oh.
we're seeing it.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
Okay, good. Okay, where was I? Where am I? Oh, there. Okay. Back to. I think it's going to start over. Okay. So did the emptying and filling the cup make sense to you when you see it that way, right? And I thought if I did it again, I'd probably even update or change or add more words, right? That's 14 years ago we did that. And so, yeah. Any questions about that or? Okay. So here's the basic. If you could see the slide, I'll read along too, because I know sometimes reading on screens is annoying. So peace education aims to help learners of all ages examine and understand the various impediments to peace, the structural forces at play that limit peaceful and just conditions, the root causes of these impediments and limitations, the role each of us can play as agents of change to embody and enact peace on personal, interpersonal, communal, and global levels, and E, methods of nonviolent communication and action. And while this seems a little redundant, we do have clear goals. We want to respond to problems of violence and conflict in society. We want to create a just and sustainable future. We want to create a culture of peace in classrooms, schools, homes, society, and beyond. We'd like classrooms to be critical, analytical, and have reflective practice, which is something that doesn't often happen, and provide a fuller perspective of the world and issues. I'll pause there for a minute because David, you're reminding me too that, textbook companies make their textbooks often like McGraw-Hill and other based on what certain states demand. So I could say this as a biology teacher, both Florida and Texas do not have evolution included in their science textbooks, right? They're also in the process of removing the real history of enslavement in this country. And so, right. So that's part of the teaching things into a box instead of trying to make things a broader picture. And the last one too is give the skills of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building, which are three different concepts. Do people get that? Or do you want me to do a 30-second, what's the difference between those? What do we say? Yes, and a quick, all right. And I put them in this order because it's sort of, steps. So peacekeeping is, I often think of the blue helmets from the UN, right? Or the person who's in the space who tries to keep the kids from not fighting on the playground, or to keep a conflict at bay, or to make sure women and children aren't getting killed, right? Which hasn't happened in the past year and a half, right? So, right. But this notion, and kids in schools, like I was like a hall monitor in 5th grade, I wore a little badge, right? That was like peacekeeping. It's really good, actually. I don't mean to belittle it, but meaning like to just make sure things don't get out of hand, right? Peacemaking is that next step of saying, how do we get people to talk to each other? How do we build bridges? How do we address conflicts either as they're going in a meaningful way or in a reflective way so that they don't keep going, so we make some kind of true peace thing. And then peace building is, in essence, trying to build a society or a community of any size that's grounded in these aims and goals of peace education. So it's like peacekeeping is like maybe the very first foundation if you're building a building, right? Like you need that. We have to keep peace. So we might build that ground floor or put the piles in the earth, right? To get that peacekeeping. And then peacemaking, might be the rest of the foundation, like the 2x4s starting to make the walls, right? So that we have a clear structure of how we want to move forward. And then peace building is finishing the structure to say, this is how we live now, right? We want to do this. We want to change systems that are harmful and make it about peace building, right? To create a sustainable concept of peace. Because peacekeeping is important, but if the peacekeeper isn't there, we have to go, oh gosh, is it going to stick, right? Like, right? Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I want to do is, I'm not going to go to the next slide. I'm actually stop sharing for like a moment and ask folks just to either unmute or drop them in the chat. After we talked about this, I want, in your words, what are some of the obstacles to peace that we're living through? You can just unmute and say it, or if it's easier, just pop it in the chat. Okay, good. We got some in here. Nice. Greed and capitalism, fear, intolerance in politics.
Media, social media, turning us all into our own little cocoons.
Siloing, right? Apathy, ignorance. And yes, So there's anger and there's grief. We could throw trauma in there, right? Yeah. Lack of imagination, accepting the myth that I must fix all things, which is too much, a paralysis of fear. Yes. Refusal to accept that it could happen here. Oh yeah. Evangelical Christianity being co-opted by white supremacy and white Christian nationalism. Yep. History not seen in its totality. Very good. Intolerance, yearning for vengeance. Yeah. Yeah. I always attempt to say these are all good, but you know what I mean. They're bad, but your ideas are good, right? Too busy just surviving, no time to organize, right? A function of poverty, right? If you're trying to survive, you know, that's about it. Capitalism, good. You're heading, there we are. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you for that. I'm going to return to the share. And because I did make my list, but then I'm going to save the chat and I'm going to add all yours because every time I just keep adding things, right? So you said some of these: inequality, poverty, discrimination, alienation, militarism, how society is structured, religious fanaticism, which was said better by other folks, apocalyptic thinking, right? That's, you know, dehumanization. Where am I? Okay. So I had more fun than ever doing this slide, I have to say. Oh, I see something else in the chat first, right? The delusion of separation. Very good. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Yes, right? And I find myself a lot in peace ed. And I remember when I went to seminary, Betty and I were having lunch across the street from the seminary, and she said, I'm so excited you're doing this. And I was like, okay, because it's going to cost a lot of money, right? I went to seminary in my late 40s as a single mother. It was maybe not the best choice in the world, but I loved it and we got through it. But Betty was saying, I think it is going to be so important that you can bring this interreligious perspective to peace education, right? And so I often talk a lot about non-duality and things with my students who, it's a new concept, right? But so thank you, Jeff. We'll add some of that. So I enjoy doing this because I was like, all right, so we do this practice of this not knowing, bearing witness, and taking action. And it's very parallel to some of the things we do in peace education. Our not knowing is how we question our assumptions, right? So I'll give an example. I was co-teaching a class years ago at university, and we were talking about conflicts, and I guess we were going to watch a film about the Bosnian, war, and we first came up with an assumption sheet, and we had all the students, it was grad school to be fair, and we had them all write down on one side of the paper the assumptions they were carrying before they watched this film. What did they know about it? What did they think they knew about it? What did they heard about it? Did they have feelings about it? Then we watched this documentary, and then on the other side of the paper was, and we had themes for some of the assumptions, right? Like, who's involved, who's being harmed, what's the US doing, what's the UN doing, things like that. Gosh, I wish I still had a copy of it, but I don't know. And then after, we'd have a discussion and then have them write in things they learned or these new takeaways that help them expand the way they were conceiving the issue or the problem, right? I also do something like this at the start of my course on climate change, where we dump everything that we're carrying, right? Like what we know, what we don't know, what we're questioning, what we're worried about, what the media says versus what the scientists say. And it's a real good way of doing the living into the not knowing. I mean, climate change is a little harder because we know it's happening, but we still get into conversations with people who are wanting to debate it. So I think it's actually a helpful tool, right? And so we question our assumptions, and then we do a similar thing about bearing witness, which is where we examine an issue from multiple points of view and look at root causes, which is really, that's what I was going to say earlier, and I stopped myself. This is central to peace education. We get lost in the issue leaves because we don't dig down into the roots, right? And I'm going to explain more about that in a moment. But when we're doing, like I remember the other day, just sitting on my cushion doing my bearing witness beads. And that's when I was like, oh my God, this is such a perfect matchup, right? Like if we look at things from multiple perspectives, and sometimes I will literally make a diagram with, like a circle with like a whole bunch of, like a pizza, but with 16 slices or 8 slices, right? and encourage students to think of what perspectives they want to look at it through. When they're with me in like a first year class or second year, I actually hand them something and it's broken down by, race, ethnicity, language, country of origin, gender, sex, sexuality, age, education levels. Did I say class, socioeconomic, right? Like I have taken to calling it the fly eye lens. Right. So, flies have these compound eyes, right? If you've ever seen those photos that people, scientists showing you what flies see, or a Picasso or a Juan Gris, you could say, right? Like they're looking at things from multiple perspectives simultaneously. So I usually, for this one, I'm like, how do we use the fly eye lens on an issue? And I wish I could say it's always helpful when you're talking to people, but it is definitely helpful. Like it's helpful for an internal practice for me. It's helpful when I'm teaching, and it's helpful when I'm trying to have conversations with people who are like completely on the other side of the thought world than I am, right? Like, well, can you take it from this perspective? What do you think that person thinks or feels? Or right? That makes sense, right? I mean, I think we take it for granted that everybody does this, but I think a lot of people don't, do the point of view work that maybe helps. So then when I thought about the taking action, I don't know if you remember, but in one of the papers that the kids put into the jar was future oriented. And it's not like in the living in the wreckage of the future, like we say in the rooms or other things. It's more like imagining an alternative outcome in the future and then taking steps to live it into being, right? Knowing, there are most things beyond our control, but the idea of just even living into imagination. So just last night, our practice at the start of the climate class was, they all got a piece of paper that said, I envision a world where, and they spent 15 minutes coloring or drawing or making lists or writing, like, in essence, why they're taking this course or why they're, and then what do they see and what do they want to see? And then they went around the room and had little conversations with each other to talk about their vision for the world. And then we flipped the paper over and we drew concentric circles. And we said, okay, here's something I can do. I'm in the center, personal change. Here's something I could do with the closest people I interact with, whether it's family or dorm mates or classmates, right? And then is there something I could try in my community, right? Like, I've got it pretty lucky. I'm an educator. I run a nonprofit there. I do education through. Like, I feel like I can do a lot of this stuff in this way, but I think there, any of us could probably do that, right? And then it goes on to the bigger part. But we'll often find that when we stay close to that circle is where we feel like we are really enacting and putting down like the pavers for this new world that we want to get to. Maybe that could be part of our discussion, right? So I'm just going to show a few more slides because I want us to at least be able to have questions for like 30 minutes and discussion, if that's okay for folks. Unless someone has a question right now. So I should be fair. No? All right. We'll come back to it. Okay, good. I also liked this one. That's supposed to say core values, not obstacles to peace. I'm catching my errors, even if I checked it 4 times. Okay, that's okay. So on the left, again, and the precepts come next, but I wanted this order, right? We commit to a reverence for all life, a sustainable and ethical economy, equal rights for all, and stewardship of the earth. And as I was rereading it, on the Peace Ed website, we have our own core values. Now, Betty in the 80s came up with core values that guided peace education. And they were humane relationship, global citizenship, and earth stewardship, planetary stewardship. Yeah, planetary stewardship, humane relationship, and global citizenship. And I had used them all my years of teaching, my beginning of preaching into seminary. And about 2 years ago, I had a student in class said, some of those words don't work in our society anymore. Like citizenship is a questionable thing in a country that doesn't actually grant people asylum and they have to hide, right? Or they have to wait forever to get their case. And I was like, yeah, so it's not just about citizens in that way. I think of it as Carl Sagan always said, citizens of the cosmos. So I changed that to global consciousness. And then planetary stewardship another conversation with a student and then a colleague at a theology and science conference. We were talking about stewardship is this caring for, which makes us separate from the planet. And being one with it is part of the, is one of our impediments, right? Not being one with it is an impediment to peace, right? So how do I reframe that? And that's what I called holistic earth care, because it's, I don't know, it's working for me as more encompassing. And then the humane relationship also felt to me that it's a low bar to treat people humanely, right? Number one. And it has in it human, which leaves out all other forms of life, right? So that's when I came up with relational existence. And I have descriptions of this, I actually put it in an article I published too, right? So, but I also thought there was just these nice parallel between these values, right? If you ignore the obstacles to peace, I can't believe that. But other than that, right? It makes sense. I hope it makes sense because it made sense to me. So, and so then I put our precepts because I just was like reading them again. I was like, okay, we know we're peace builders through these precepts, but why couldn't we use these as teaching tools as well, right? To our non-Buddhist friends, right? Like I want to play with that in my courses and things, right? So the last, I think, slide, or my penultimate slide, is basically like, how do we do this, right? And some of them are things that are pretty obvious and yet still not done enough, right? Because I think some of the things you mentioned that are our impediments to society, right? So we're really keen on critical thinking. First thing you read is not the only thing you read, right? The first opinion you form may not be the first opinion. We learn collaboratively. So my example earlier about things being super competitive, instead of it being like the first one to finish this math quiz, it's more like, let's all do collaborative work, whether it's projects or making sure our classmates are, instead of, everyone is getting their needs met in this collaborative learning way. I already talked about questioning assumptions, perspective taking, and examining root causes. And that's my next slide. Dialogue and active listening. Like, it's amazing how few people, myself included, like I like to make the joke, it's not a joke, that, I was raised by, wild Italian people, and I thought yelling at each other was a valid form of communication. You know what? It actually isn't, right? I didn't learn that till I was an adult. And I didn't learn that people should listen to you, right? Like we are always on top of each other, right? So just a couple of weeks ago, I did an active learning workshop at a mutual aid organization up by me in Kingston. And people were blown away. They were like actually crying because they said, I don't know if I've had anybody ever listen to me that closely in my life. And you think about how important it is for us to try and hear one another, and yet we don't try to hear one another, right? So that dialogue and active listening, instead of debates, like in schools, we love to have debates, but that's competitive. That's about side taking. What if instead it was a dialogue or a listening and then a collaborative way to come to consensus? I forgot to put that on there. We use consensus judgment in my classes. Also reflection when you're learning. I mean, again, preaching to the choir here, you got to sit with stuff. And in school, it's like next thing, next thing, next thing. I mentioned the futures thinking. I think responsibility has already been assumed. And the last one, Betty put out these 7 R's. And so I picked a couple to include, and she has reverence as one of them. And I'm like, I have a hard time because I think we live in a time right now where we have so little reverence for life in whatever form, right? And we have people who are more bent on vengeance than reverence for a planet, or reverence for people's human rights, or reverence for life, or whatever. So this is the root cause tree. This is an activity that when we get off of here, we can talk about it. I've actually had success with this. I've also had non-success with this, whatever that means, or meaning like people. So when we have an issue in a community, we often focus on the issue, right? And I would say that the issue are the leaves, right? Not just Peace Ed would say, right? So if we're looking at something in our community, if we're looking at climate change, if we're looking at, how people are treated in a given context, even globally, and you fill in all those leaves, right? Then you take time and you try to peel the onion, right? Or dig in and think, what are the root causes of those things, right? So people can't afford to feed their families. Again, I'll give an example because I think that helps. I was leading this thing called the World Cafe, which is an open dialogue it's a guided dialogue, really, I should say. And we were talking about the community of Kingston, where there's a lot of folks who can't afford to live and other things. And we did a brain dump of the leaves, right? And then we started talking about some of the root causes of that through questions. So we didn't go hardcore into the root causes because it was a very mixed bag of people. But some of the root causes was like when people were saying, well, people don't feel like it's a community. And so if you think about that and you go one layer deeper, it's like, to Jeff's point, it's like there's separation, right? We don't feel connected to one another. If we go deeper, we can realize that a root cause of that is racism. That's in our DNA. And as someone put, a root cause of that is Christian imperialism, right? And then my favorite root cause that I talk about a lot is capitalism. Capitalism is not designed for us to like make sure other people's needs are met. It's to make sure our needs are met, right? So I've done this where we picked an issue, put a few leaves on the tree, and then in a circle process, had people try to dig deep into the roots. Because what happens, instead of arguing then about I'm right, you're wrong about the leaves, we can say, yeah, but the roots are all affecting us some way. Let's talk about the roots. And then maybe you'll get somewhere. I've had examples where people just didn't want to hear me at all. And I said, okay, that's the end of that, right? But I hope this image or the idea of the root cause tree maybe helps you. And I might have other examples. So my closing slide is I saw this graffiti somewhere and it's what I keep thinking about. So another world is possible. So I'm going to stop my share and see if we can have some question time.
Feel free to, if your video's on, feel free to wave your hand. We'll see you, or use your electronic hand. Sheila, are you waving your hand, or are you? There you go.
I am. Thank you. Oh my goodness. I just want to eat all of that up. And I guess my question is this: how may I learn the most? I have already got a meeting on Monday to talk to some very important people in Denver about how I could be teaching this exact kind of thing. How can I'm not expert. I've got my heart on a limb here and I need some assistance and mutual understanding so I can be best in this. Does that make any sense? I offered myself and I'm not sure I'm the expert. So
well, I'm going to give you a little Betty lecture on that. So first of all, I'm thrilled and delighted.
Okay.
And I never used the word expert because one day, taxi from the United Nations, right? Betty got us all internships at the UN when we were in 1999 or something, 2000. And we would all, we'd go to our respective rooms at the UN, spend the day, and then we'd all either take the train or take a taxi back up to Columbia. And one day I was aggravated by this person who was talking about clean water stuff, right? And so biologist Leonisa and science teacher Leonisa was getting all, cracked off a little. And I was like, she should be an expert. She should know exactly what people are going to. And Betty looked at me and said, nope. And then she just gave me the what for. But the point of her what for was the second people deem themselves as experts, they've basically turned that lifelong learning switch off. So let's remember that no matter what work we're doing, we can always learn, right? We can learn from our students. We can learn from somebody else. Like I've been teaching a long time. I listen to my students a heck of a lot more than like maybe other people will. So don't get bogged down that you're not an expert, because actually I think you'll do better at trying to do peace education by being a co-learner with whoever you're trying to learn with, right? So I dropped our website in there. It's the one that is currently up, and it'll probably change a day or two. I do monthly online intro to peace ed workshops, which is very similar to this, but I want to start adding like a free, like, let's plan some curriculum, or it could be the kind of thing where I could zoom in somewhere, talk about it. Like I've done that. I've gone to a couple schools and told them about it so that they could decide if they want us to come in, or, so I do a lot of work with teachers. I do things with youth. We write curriculum. I actually have a grant to have 2 students work with me this summer to create a K-12 like handbook during dangerous times, you know, in essence, right? So I put my email, I put the PSED email so that email, I can make sure it doesn't get buried in my ministry box. So anyone, any questions, if you want readings, go to the email me. And the PSED website, we have a curriculum tab, and it takes you to this other site called Padlet. And we have synopses of readings of peace education that we keep adding to, right? We have some curriculum examples. We have a ton of resources that we've sourced from other places, and we just keep adding things to it. So is that?
Yes, if I could just say briefly why I'm saying this and saying it publicly. I'm in Denver, Colorado. I'm going to be doing this kind of curriculum. I have no idea how to. I'm a social worker by trade, an actual licensed therapist. I learned from my education that I know so little, and my greatest source is others. So we're doing this. If you'd like to reach out to me, I need help and I would love to connect. So that's my deal. I'll put my own personal email in the chat. Love to chat with whoever.
And anybody else, we can make a little group of us who want to keep talking peace ed. I would love that. So thank you. Yes, David.
I'm usually very quiet in these groups, as Jeff can attest. So I just wanted to note, Sheila, I'm also in Denver. So it would be great to get together for coffee or a beer or something like that.
Right away. Let's do it.
So I'll email you and we can connect. So I've recently gotten involved in the Denver immigrant peace or protection teams that's being organized by the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization. So, and I'm actually going to be the liaison between the immigrant protection teams and the Interfaith Immigrant Network. So kind of rings true for me. And that's what's got me energized and activated and positive. So I just wanted to share that. And I think American Friends is probably doing this around the country. I know there's 19 immigrant protection teams just in Colorado now.
Wow.
So just a heads up. The thing that I'm struggling with is how to stay out of rage, despondency, despair. I feel like I'm living in Nazi Germany right now in the US. And I feel like I'm living in a nightmare. And so the broader context of tumult and turmoil that we're in, I'm really interested to hear from you and from others on the call as just how do we deal with that sort of broader sense of the earth kind of disappearing from under our feet, and how does peace education kind of filter into that?
That's a great one. Is it okay if I go first? And other folks, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So I have the more secular answer and then the spiritual answer, right? Like I think peace ed feeds into that in the, it's hard for me to separate it as who I am now, but I think what's good about it is if we keep doing these practices of imagining futures, and I'm going to say too, like I had a really hard time last spring and summer. Like I just couldn't function. Like, I mean, it really got to me, or the way the world was looking, and even into the fall. But I think there's a piece of it is I've discovered that the more time I spend in community talking about the visions we have and the ideas that we have, and in particular, I feel so blessed that I get to spend it with young people who are also freaking out. So it also sort of holds me to like not freak out, but instead hold them. And then we share ideas of what could we do? How could we live differently? So that's one piece of it that I think peace education is grounded in, is like these dialogues that we can have. And it's not, I know there's always this push that we should talk to people other than who's in our like ideological bubble. But I think that at times that is exactly what we need, is to be around the people who are going to nurture our spirit. So yes, see, I can't stay in the secular for very long, right? Because I think the other piece of it is the spiritual dimension, which is building that support community. And I really realize it's like having spiritual practice and spiritual grounding. And so one of the things we did last year that we're figuring out how to add back in this year, because we didn't do it at the start of the year because we were moving spaces, is having spiritual grounding moments, right? So we're trying one online where people can come in who are feeling the weight of the world, and we could share like almost like grief circles, but then moving it into listening to music and having some of that. We also want to bring in-person ones for our direct community, because we have a lot of folks also working on immigrant rights, among other issues up here. And I'll tell you too, an example, it's like the day after the election, my morning class, I knew my students, right, like were going to be shot, right? Like their minds were, and they came in, I threw out my lesson plan, which I do regularly, but this one I definitely, it was 80 something degrees in November in New York. So there's another part of the problem, right? But we went outside, we sat on the lawn in a circle, and we did a ritual of lament. We wrote down what we were feeling. And then I got a little basket and we all shared what we were comfortable sharing, put it in the basket. And then I told them I was going to take it home and burn it because we can't open fires. It was that time of the year, right? So I burnt it and sent them a video. But then after we did that, half the class cried. We listened to music. We colored like these beautiful, like, rest images and butterflies and mandala images. And I was like, today is not a day for us to talk about what we read this week. We're just going to take care of ourselves. And I am a person who never takes my own advice. And so I say this deliberately out loud every time I do a workshop so that I remember to take that time, whether it's by myself or with the people who nourish me or something artistic or something. I don't know if that's a practical answer, David, but that's what I got. So I don't know. Does anyone else have a practice they've lived into? I think, spiritual practices are really key at this time. Yeah. Hi, David. Yeah, good. Sorry.
I'm not sure I would, my immediate response, David Gibson, is to listen and play the blues. And I've been going back and listening to a lot of documentaries of early 30s, 40s blues musicians. The blues is not just about being overwhelmed. The blues is not just the pain. It's medicine. And I really appreciate hearing you're bringing music into this, because there's a whole kind of, I was thinking of the 60s and Joan Baez, and there was a movement where music was seemingly really important, and it wasn't making people money necessarily. It wasn't selling records. It wasn't being stars. It was a real powerful kind of glue and I can't think of the words, but I'm aching for that all the time. That in so many cultures, the dance, the music, the artists it's everyone engaged in these kinds of activities as part of the form and structure of the whole society. And a lot of it on a daily basis, to me, it's really missing or hidden. But I don't want to see it diminished. It's so critical to me, at least.
Yeah. I appreciate that so much, David, but for me, it's usually jazz. So I am a musician. I'm a jazz musician. And so that's right. And I just dropped in the chat that everybody should just go listen to A Love Supreme by John Coltrane at least once a week, right? And see if but David, I love your point, because it's not just the listening. I mean, it's not just the sentiment, it's the what we create when we do that. And when we listen in community and what comes up, like we live maybe in one side of ourselves, or we live up here most of the time, and then we're bombarded, and then what happens is we just collapse. We need the things that bolster us and bring us into like the goodness. The line I usually always, one of my prayer lines is, let us be brokers of justice and joy. And I have that as a reminder too, right? And so if music is the thing that brings you joy, like we gotta live into it. So yeah. Thanks.
So long as it includes the flatted fifth.
And a sharp 9.
Anyone else here? We've got just a bit more than 10 minutes. Carolyn.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
There. Sorry, little screen, hard to unmute. I'm wondering if what David was just saying about music and community, if that is happening online. And by my comment before about people cocooning and isolating with social media, you can tell I really judge social media as being this, the bringer of the evil. But it might be that is where, the experience that we had in our youth of music and all those things that you were just describing, maybe it's happening there. And maybe, oh my God, I have such disdain for this term influencer, but maybe influencers are doing this. And I won't know because I'm not trying to find them or be part of that. So maybe there's a future where it can happen through a media that I had, disdain is the right word, but here we are because of media. So there, I have nothing really to give there. I'd throw in a question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I have a 22-year-old, right? And so her life is like this device, right? And I just made the decision. So in 3 days, I'm closing my social media accounts because I've just decided that there's more toxicity than ebullience, than support, right? Like I just made that decision. So I'm slowly downloading and whatever. And I know there are spots for it, but I also am with you on the disdain, and it really hit me. Like I don't use it a lot. I left Facebook years ago, right? So I'm just slowly this censorship and this rise of who gets through and the algorithm and the influencers. To me, I also, it feels like it falls into the King and Galtung negativity more than I see it as a positive outlet. What I do have is a few Signal groups, which are Signal's another app that's fully encrypted. I have one of all ministers. I have one of faculty, right? Like where we're working for it. Mostly it's justice and Palestinian justice groups, right? But there are other ones too. There's like a, divestment from fossil fuels group, right? And we check in that way, but it also can be overwhelming. I think everyone has to see where that lands for you. But I wanted to say that I mirror your disdain because I just see, I guess, again, because I spend time now with tech natives, as they're called, right? Like Gen Z, and they're even saying like, I don't think this is ever a good idea for us to be on these things for what, and so I'm leaning into that myself. Yeah. Not all of them, even my own kid, she's like, yeah, I get it, and so she's trying, but it's quite addictive for a lot of them, but I appreciate that, Carolyn. So.
Here's one moment. Monday evenings at 7:00. Sylvain Leroux is a musician in New York City. He's offering for free an hour of his own music from his living room. And he is an amazing flute player. He is involved with a school in West Africa, keeping traditional music alive. So he's multi-instrumental. So it's an hour using the media, to me, in a really wonderful, positive way. And so it's possible. And if you look up Sylvain Leroux, you could drop in on his Monday evening hour of music.
I just asked if you could drop it in the chat or maybe in the Hive, David, if you, yeah. And can you type the name in so we spell it correctly? And I'll also give folks the, what we were calling now our activist hang, but we're going to see what form it takes. And I can send that to folks too, if you want to drop into like I think we have it on a Monday too. I don't know when it is yet, but that was our thinking too, that we'd listen to music. I did that during the pandemic. I had jazz vespers every Wednesday night so that we could get through the rest of the week. And I'd just do a little chat. I'd play some of my favorite jazz music. My friends gave me permission to play their records and things. And then we'd meditate together, and we'd do it for a half hour. It was like and I was like, maybe I should bring that back. It was pretty nice, but live music is even better. So I want to check this out.
I think I want to jump in here. So we have all three Davids. First thing I'd like to say, Leonisa, is how this has landed for me. And then I have a question. It feels a little embarrassing to say, but I feel like I have committed myself to walking peace in the world. And today's session has allowed me at a subtle level to realize that it's in more parts of my life than just what's happening in the war world, or in it's opened up. My walk for peace is when I go to the grocery store. It's so that's how this session, you're educating about peace, has landed for me. And the question I have relates to both Davids. And I think the key to what they both spoke to is in your active listening statement. And I'd like you to define what you mean by active listening. So as I'm sitting here, I'm asking myself, when was I listening inactively? So that's my question.
That's great. First of all, thank you for sharing that with me. You've made my week. So thank you very much. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so I'm talking about active listening as an actual practice, but you're reminding me too that it doesn't need to be with a partner, right? I think, so most of us travel through the world listening to respond, right? So when you're in meetings, right, we're listening and then we're getting ready. Well, I'm going to say this, or I'm going to, right? So we're half listening, right? Because our brain isn't fully there, right? So it's not a full mindfulness moment, right? So active listening is, how do we sweep away all this other stuff so that we have a single focus, right? So it's, in many ways, it's a manifestation of a meditation practice, but through our ears, right? And so that's why it's interesting that the music stuff came up, because, when you listen to Coltrane or something else, it's like you're listening, right? You're not you could listen to music while you do your dishes and things like that. But I really like to listen to music to just listen to music sometimes, right? And the practice of active listening is so what I do with students and workshops is you share a story. I often make it a time when we were feeling particularly oppressed so that everyone can tap into the fact that, because we poo-poo the old white males in the room, right? Sorry, fellas, right? But that's what happens. But, at some point in time, someone picked on you. At some point in time, someone called you out because of something, right? So I like to do that practice, or a time when you felt not seen or something. And what you do is and it's a great thing to practice, is you get to talk for 3 minutes or, however, 2, 3, 4 minutes straight, and no one interrupts you. And no one asks, like, tell me more about that, or can you repeat that? The person you're talking to is completely focused on you. They're really not even supposed to do the grunt or the nod or whatever. It's like literally they are taking in everything you're saying, and then they recap to you and you make any corrections. So they say, I heard you saying blah, blah, whatever, right? X, Y, and Z. And it's part of peace education, but it's also part of chaplaincy, right? When I worked as a chaplain, in a hospital, I wasn't saying people tell me more, I literally just listened to them. And then I'd say, I'm hearing you say this, right? It was different because it was more about feelings and what they needed from me, like prayer or whatever. But in a peace ed context, like, can you imagine like setting up meetings where people are like, it's kind of like a no crosstalk to an nth degree, right? But in one-on-ones, especially where someone shares, the other fully listens, the other recaps, you clarify, and then you move on. And it can be quite profound to be listened to, and it can be quite profound to feel what happens in your body when you only listen, right? Like some people are like, oh my God, I've never paid that much attention for 3 minutes in my life, right? Maybe not Buddhists, but lots of folks haven't had that, right? Does that answer that, David? Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, it's beautiful. And I just would like to add, the flip side is when I reflect back and I've heard through my filter, not what was communicated. And
Yes.
that to me is the way of peace.
Exactly, right? 'Cause
Coming to harmony of truth.
Precisely, right? Because we're putting our filter in there and the person says, I didn't use that word. That happens a lot. And they're like, oh, you're like, oh, that's my stuff coming up, right? Like, yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. Yeah. Mhm.
Reminds me of that expression from a long time ago. It goes something like, you say you understand what you think I said, but what you don't realize is what I said is not what I meant.
Woo, right? Yeah.
Trains passing in the night. We've got about another minute here, folks. If somebody has one last comment or question.
And if anyone wants to drop their emails, although I can get it from Jeff or I could post things on the Hive, it's up to you all. You can also add emails and I can add you to our mailing list. I only send one a month. So I'm not annoying. Go ahead. And then I'll also write you personally.
Relative to what you were just talking about in terms of listening, and I know many of you here have the experience of being in council, but if you've not done that, Zen Peacemakers offers council almost every week, different kinds of format. Mental health workers, there's a women's only council once a month, and council is the place where we learn to do this. And there's no prior training to do council. In fact, it's great, to step into it for your first time. But it's a powerful practice, just like Leonisa was talking about. So I invite you to join that. And with that, I think we need to wrap. Leonisa, thank you very, very much. And thank you everybody for sticking with us for the hour and a half. And be sure to come again. This is community. It is virtual. It's online, but if you listen closely, you can feel it and you can hear it. So here we are together.